They told us he was a god, that he sacrificed himself to save mankind, but no one explained what keeps him alive. Every day, 1,000 psychers are dragged to Terra. Their souls are burned like fuel, not as punishment, as maintenance. The Astronomicon only shines because people are screaming inside it. So I'll ask you this. If a god needs that much suffering just to survive, what does that make him? I learned the truth when I stopped thinking of him as a man. That was the first mistake we all made, or perhaps the last mercy we allowed ourselves. We called him the master of mankind, the god emperor, the anathema, and in doing so we gave him qualities that suggested presence, intention, perhaps even care. But those who worked closest to the machinery of his will knew better. We knew that what sustained the Imperium was not divinity in any comprehensible sense, but something far more terrible and far more necessary. I am Astropath Seneschal Callus Drain, and for 37 years I served within the psychic architecture that keeps our species alive. I maintained relays. I calibrated soul engines. I watched as human beings were rendered into signal, suffering converted to light. And I came to understand that the Emperor is not cruel because he chooses to be. He is cruel because cruelty, at the scale required to save 1 million worlds, becomes indistinguishable from function. This is not a confession, though it may sound like one. This is an accounting. The Basilica Luminis stands on Ophelia VII, a cathedral world where every stone has been consecrated and every breath carries the scent of burning incense. It rises from the planet's northern continent like a tooth of black iron and white marble, visible from orbit, a structure so vast that weather systems form in its upper spires. I was assigned there after my sanctioning, after the black ships had taken me from my birth world and I had survived the soul-binding ritual that left me half-blind and forever marked. The Basilica housed one of the tertiary nodes of the Astronomicon relay network, a fragment of the great psychic beacon that allowed our ships to navigate the warp. Without it, entire sectors would go dark. Without it, worlds would starve. Without it, the Imperium would fracture into 1 billion isolated kingdoms, each one waiting for the Xenos or the Heretic or simple entropy to finish what the Age of Strife began. I arrived during the Feast of the Emperor's Ascension, when the entire world turned its gaze toward Terra, and 10,000 choirs sang in unison. The Basilica's halls were filled with pilgrims, their faces painted with devotional sigils, their voices raised in hymns that spoke of salvation and sacrifice. I walked among them and felt nothing. The soul binding had taken much from me, including the capacity for simple faith. What remained was clarity, cold and sharp, the ability to perceive the warp's tides without the comfort of misunderstanding what I saw. The other astropaths called it the hollow sight. I called it honesty. My quarters were deep within the Basilica's central spire, a small stone cell with a single window that looked out over the pilgrim roads. I could see them from there, the endless processions of the faithful, their bodies thin from fasting, their eyes bright with the kind of hope that only ignorance permits. They came to Ophelia VII to be closer to him, to feel the touch of his light, and they had no idea what that light cost. They had no idea that every prayer they offered was answered not by compassion but by a machine of such complexity and horror that even I, who worked within it, could barely comprehend its full scope. The first time I entered the relay chamber, I understood that I had been assigned to something beyond my training. The chamber was located 3 kilometers beneath the Basilica's foundation, carved into the planetary bedrock and lined with psychically reactive ceramite. It was cold there, always cold, the kind of cold that seeped into your bones and made you forget what warmth felt like. The walls were inscribed with wards so dense that they overlapped, each one a prayer, or a binding, or a scream rendered into high Gothic script. The air tasted of metal and ozone. The floor was smooth, black stone, polished by centuries of footsteps, and at the chamber's center stood the relay itself. It was not a machine in any conventional sense. It was a throne, or perhaps an altar, constructed from materials I could not identify. Psychically conductive alloys, bone fused with blessed silver, fragments of something that might have been stone or might have been petrified flesh. 7 cables extended from its base, each one as thick as a man's torso, descending into the floor and vanishing into the conduits that connected this place to the network beyond. The throne was occupied. It was always occupied. The relay could not function without a living conduit, a psyker powerful enough to channel the Astronomican's fragment and disciplined enough to endure the process without succumbing to madness or death. The woman seated there was named Selandria Vec. She had held the position for 11 years, longer than any of her predecessors. Her body was thin to the point of translucence, her skin stretched tight over bones that seemed too fragile to support her. Her eyes were open but unseeing, their pupils dilated and milky, reflecting nothing. Her hands gripped the throne's armrests, fingers locked in place by calcified muscle and scar tissue. She was connected to the throne by neural interfaces that pierced her skull in 17 places, each one leaking a thin, clear fluid that never dried. She breathed, barely, her chest rising and falling in shallow intervals that suggested her body had forgotten how to stop. I stood before her and felt the weight of what I was seeing. This was the cost. This was what it meant to serve him. Selandria was not suffering because she had been punished. She was suffering because her suffering was necessary. The fragment of the Astronomican that she channeled required a living anchor, a mind capable of withstanding the psychic pressure of a billion souls screaming in unison. It required someone who could bear the Emperor's will without breaking, or at least without breaking quickly. Selandria had lasted 11 years, the previous occupant had lasted 9, the one before that 6. There was no rotation, no relief, no mercy. Once you were placed in the throne, you remained there until your body failed or your mind shattered, and then another psyker was selected, and the process began again. I was her replacement when the time came. I was her apprentice until then. The work was simple in theory. I monitored the relay's stability, adjusted the psychic dampeners when the signal fluctuated, and ensured that Selandria's vitals remained within acceptable parameters. Acceptable did not mean comfortable. It meant functional. Her heart rate was erratic, spiking and plummeting without pattern. Her brain activity showed constant theta wave suppression, indicating a state somewhere between deep meditation and coma. Her body temperature hovered at 34 degrees, low enough to slow cellular decay but not low enough to kill her. She was fed through an IV that delivered a nutrient solution designed to keep her alive without requiring digestion. She was hydrated the same way. Waste was removed through catheters. Her existence had been reduced to pure function, and that function was to burn. I asked my predecessor, an elderly astropath named Jorun Mal, how long Selandria was expected to last. He looked at me with his empty eye sockets, the black ships having taken his sight decades ago, and said that she would last as long as she was needed. I asked him what happened when she failed. He told me that I would take her place, and that I should not waste time with questions that had no comfort in their answers. The days passed in a rhythm dictated by the relay's demands. I woke each morning in my cell, descended to the relay chamber, and spent the next 16 hours monitoring equipment that I only barely understood. The Adeptus Mechanicus had designed the systems, and they spoke in binaric cant when they came to perform maintenance, their augmented voices clicking and whirring in patterns that excluded meaning from anyone not blessed by the Omnissiah. I learned to interpret their work through observation, watching as they adjusted flow regulators and recalibrated psychic resonance coils. I learned that the relay was not designed to be understood by human minds, but to function despite them. Selandria never spoke. I never expected her to. But sometimes, when the signal was particularly strong, her lips would move, forming words that had no sound. I leaned close once, trying to hear what she was saying, and I felt the temperature drop another degree. Her breath smelled like copper and ash. Her words, when I finally made them out, were not words at all but numbers, coordinates, sector designations, a litany of locations where the Astronomican's light was needed most. She was not speaking to me. She was not speaking to anyone. She was simply channeling, her mind no longer her own, her thoughts replaced by the signal she carried. I realized then that she was already dead in every way that mattered. The relay network extended across the segmentum obscurus, a web of nodes and substations that amplified and redirected the Astronomican's light. Each node required a living conduit, a psyker bound to a throne, their suffering converted into psychic stability. The network was not designed to be efficient, it was designed to be effective. The Emperor's light reached us from Terra, traveling through the warp in ways that defied conventional physics, and at each node it was received, filtered, and retransmitted by minds that burned themselves out in the process. The system was self-sustaining only because the black ships brought new psychers every year, enough to replace those who failed, enough to keep the light burning. I began to understand the scale of it. Thousands of nodes, tens of thousands of psychers, each one a Salandria, each one locked into a throne, each one converted from a living person into a component of a machine that stretched across the galaxy. And behind it all, at the source, on Terra itself, the Emperor sat upon the golden throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers whose souls were fed into his dying body to keep him alive. 1,000 every day, 365,000 every year, for 10,000 years. The numbers were so vast that they lost meaning. But meaning was not required, function was. I stopped sleeping well. The dreams came, as they always do for those who work too close to the warp. I saw Salandria's face, her lips moving in that endless recitation of coordinates. I saw the throne, empty, waiting. I saw myself seated there, my hands locked in place, my mind erased. I woke in the dark and felt the basilica's weight pressing down on me, all that stone and faith and accumulated suffering. And I wondered if anyone else understood what we were doing here. I wondered if anyone cared. The first failure occurred 3 months into my assignment. Salandria's vitals spiked without warning, her heart rate climbing to 200 beats per minute, her neural output surging beyond safe parameters. The relay chamber filled with a high-pitched whine, a sound that existed as much in the mind as in the air, and I felt the warp's presence like a hand pressing against the back of my skull. Joran Mal was there within seconds, his staff tapping against the stone floor, his ruined face turned toward the throne as if he could still see. He told me to activate the dampeners. I did, pulling the lever that flooded the throne with psychic suppressants, wards that forced the warp's presence back and stabilized the signal. Salandria convulsed, her body arching against the restraints, her mouth opening in a scream that had no sound. The cables connecting her to the throne glowed with a sickly green light, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. And I saw something move beneath her skin, something that writhed and pressed against the surface as if trying to escape. Joran Mal stepped forward and placed his hand on her forehead. He spoke a word in a language I did not recognize, a single syllable that made my teeth ache, and the movement stopped. Salandria collapsed back into the throne, her breathing shallow, her eyes rolling back until only the whites showed. The whine faded, the light dimmed, the relay stabilized. I asked him what had happened. He told me that the warp had tested her and that she had endured. I asked him how many more tests she could survive. He did not answer. The incident repeated 2 weeks later, and then again a week after that. Each time, the process was the same. Salandria's body would convulse, the warp's presence would surge, and Joran Mal would stabilize her through a combination of psychic discipline and sheer will. Each time, she came back a little less. Her breathing grew more labored. Her skin took on a grayish tint, as if the color were being leached out of her. Her weight dropped until she was little more than a skeleton wrapped in parchment. The medicae servitors that attended her adjusted her nutrient intake, increased her hydration, administered stimulants to keep her heart beating, but nothing reversed the decline. I began to understand that she was not being sustained, she was being prolonged. The distinction mattered. Joran Mal explained it to me one evening as we sat in the Basilica's meditation chapel, a small chamber lined with skulls and lit by a single candle. He told me that the Emperor's will was absolute, and that those who served him did so not out of choice but out of necessity. The Astronomicon was not a gift. It was a burden, and that burden required carriers. Salandria had been chosen because her psychic potential was strong enough to bear the load, and she would continue to bear it until her body failed. When it did, I would take her place, and I would burn just as she had burned, and when I failed, another astropath would be brought in to continue the cycle. I asked him if he had ever questioned it. He laughed, a dry sound like wind through dead leaves, and told me that questioning it was a luxury we could not afford. The Imperium's survival depended on the relay network, and the relay network depended on psychers like us. We were not people, we were infrastructure. Our suffering was not a tragedy, it was a function. I wanted to argue with him. I wanted to say that there had to be another way, that the Emperor, if he truly was a god, would not demand such a price. But I had seen the numbers. I had seen the scale of what we were maintaining, 1,000,000 worlds, trillions of souls, all of them dependent on a light that required constant sacrifice to shine. The mathematics were brutal and undeniable. The Emperor's compassion, if it had ever existed, had been replaced by necessity so vast that compassion became irrelevant. I stopped asking questions after that. The work continued. I monitored Salandria's decline, adjusted the equipment, and waited for the inevitable. I learned to recognize the signs of imminent failure, the tremors that began in her hands and spread through her body, the way her breathing would stop for long seconds before resuming, the flickers of awareness that passed across her face, brief moments where she seemed to remember who she was before the relay consumed her again. I wondered if she was still in there, somewhere, trapped inside a body that no longer belonged to her. I wondered if she knew what was being done in her name. The basilica's population swelled during the Feast of Martyrs, when pilgrims came to honor those who had died in service to the Emperor. They filled the halls and courtyards, their voices raised in hymns of loss and devotion, and I walked among them and felt the weight of their ignorance. They praised the martyrs without understanding what martyrdom meant at this scale. They spoke of sacrifice as if it were noble, as if the martyrs had chosen their fate, as if there were any honor in being reduced to fuel for a machine that cared nothing for the individual and everything for the collective. I saw a child among the pilgrims, a girl no more than 8 years old, her face painted with the Aquila. She held her mother's hand and stared up at the basilica's towering statues with wide, wondering eyes. She asked her mother if the Emperor loved them. Her mother said yes, of course he did. He loved all his children. I wanted to tell her the truth. I wanted to explain that the Emperor's love, if it existed, was so diffuse and impersonal that it could not be felt by any individual. He loved humanity in the abstract, the species as a concept, but he did not love her daughter. He could not. To love one person required the capacity to see them, and the Emperor had not seen individuals for 10,000 years. He saw only the mass, the aggregate, the billion souls, whose collective survival justified any atrocity committed in his name. But I said nothing. The child would learn the truth eventually, or she would die ignorant. Either way, it made no difference. Salandria died on the 263rd day of my assignment. Her heart stopped without warning, the rhythm that had sustained her for 11 years simply ceasing. The monitors flatlined, the relay's signal dropped to 0. Joran Mal was at her side within seconds, his hands moving over the throne's controls, trying to restart her heart, trying to salvage the connection. The Medicae servitors descended on her, their mechadendrites inserting stimulant injections, their optics flashing red as they worked. But her body did not respond. She was gone, the spark that had kept her alive finally extinguished. Joran Mal stepped back and gestured for the servitors to remove her. They detached the neural interfaces, each one pulling free with a wet sound that echoed in the chamber's silence. They lifted her from the throne, her body so light that it seemed almost weightless, and carried her to the corpse chute that would deposit her remains in the basilica's crematorium. She would be burned, her ashes scattered in the pilgrim gardens, her name added to the endless list of those who had served and died. There would be no ceremony. There would be no mourning. She had fulfilled her function, and now she was waste. Joran Mal turned to me and told me to prepare. I had known this moment was coming. I had spent months watching Salandria's decline, understanding that her fate would be mine. But knowing and experiencing are different things, and as I stepped toward the throne, I felt something inside me rebel. Not fear, exactly, something deeper. A recognition that what was about to happen to me was not punishment, but erasure. I would cease to exist as callous drain. I would become a component, a piece of the machine, my thoughts and memories and identity subsumed into the signal I carried. I sat down. The throne was still warm. The Medicae servitors moved with practiced efficiency, attaching the neural interfaces, inserting the IV lines, securing the restraints. I felt the first interface pierce my skull, a cold spike of metal sliding through bone, and the pain was immediate and total. I tried to scream, but my jaw was locked, held in place by a clamp that kept my mouth open. The second interface followed, then the third, each one a new point of agony that blossomed and spread until my entire head felt like it was burning. The servitors did not pause. They continued their work, inserting the remaining interfaces, connecting me to the throne's systems, binding me to the relay. Joran Mal stood before me and placed his hand on my chest. He spoke the activation phrase, the same word he had used to stabilize Salandria, and I felt the relay come alive. The signal hit me like a physical force. It was not light, though I perceived it as light. It was not sound, though I heard it as a roar. It was the Emperor's will, raw and unfiltered, channeled through the Astronomicon and transmitted across the warp. It was the psychic output of 10,000 years of accumulated suffering, the screams of 1 billion souls converted into a single, unbroken note. It was everything and nothing, infinite and empty, and it filled me until there was no room left for anything else. I tried to hold on to myself. I tried to remember my name, my history, the reasons I had come to this place, but the signal was too strong. It scoured away my thoughts, burned through my memories, reduced me to a conduit. I felt my identity dissolving, piece by piece, as the relay consumed me. I felt the Emperor's presence, vast and cold, a mind so immense that it could not comprehend individuals, only masses. I felt the Imperium spread out before me, 1 million worlds connected by threads of light, each one dependent on the signal I carried. And I understood. The Emperor was not evil, he was not good, he was beyond such distinctions. He was a function, a process, a system designed to preserve humanity at any cost. His continued existence required the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers, and that requirement was not cruel, it was mathematical. 1,000 lives to save 1 trillion, 1,000 deaths to prevent extinction. The scale was so vast that morality became irrelevant, compassion became a weakness, mercy became a luxury that the Imperium could not afford. I saw the worlds burning. I saw the sectors collapsing. I saw the Xenos encroaching and the heretics rising and the warp spilling through reality's cracks. I saw the thin line that separated survival from annihilation, and I saw that the Emperor stood upon that line, holding it in place through sheer force of will. He was dying. He had been dying for 10,000 years. But he could not be allowed to die, because his death would mean the death of everything. And so we burned. Salandria had burned. I was burning. 1,000 psychers burned every day on Terra, their souls fed into the Golden Throne to keep him alive. Tens of thousands burned in the relay network, their minds consumed to keep the Astronomicon shining. Millions burned across the Imperium, their lives sacrificed in wars and plagues and 1 million smaller atrocities. All of them necessary, all of them justified, because the alternative was worse. I tried to scream, but I had no mouth. I tried to rage, but I had no mind. I was the relay now, and the relay had no room for such things. Time lost meaning. I do not know how long I sat in that throne. Days became weeks, became months, became an endless, unbroken present. I channeled the signal, burning myself out 1 neuron at a time, and I felt no pain because pain required a self to experience it. I was a process. I was infrastructure. I was the Emperor's will made manifest, and his will was absolute. But there were moments, brief flickers, when I surfaced, when the signal's intensity dropped and I could remember, for just a second, that I had once been callous drain. In those moments, I felt the full weight of what had been done to me. I felt the horror of my erasure, the agony of my continued existence, and I understood that this was the price. This was what it meant to serve him. Not glory, not honor, just suffering, prolonged and purposeful, measured out in increments, calibrated to extract the maximum utility from a human life. And I understood that this was true across the entire Imperium. Every soldier who died in the trenches, every worker who collapsed in the manufactorums, every child conscripted by the black ships, every sacrifice made in his name, all of them were components in a machine designed to preserve humanity, and that machine functioned without compassion because compassion would reduce its efficiency. The Emperor was not a man. He had not been a man for 10,000 years. He was a god engine, a psychic infrastructure, a system of suffering so vast and so necessary that questioning it was pointless. You could call it evil. You could call it monstrous. But those words only had meaning if there were an alternative. And there was no alternative. The Imperium survived because of him, and he survived because of us. And the cycle continued because the cycle had to continue. I saw a memory, unbidden, rising from the wreckage of my mind. I saw the child in the pilgrim garden, the one who had asked if the Emperor loved her. I wanted to answer her now. I wanted to tell her that yes, he loved her, but his love was not comfort. His love was the cold arithmetic of survival. He loved her enough to let her live, and he loved humanity enough to sacrifice her if necessary, and there was no contradiction in that, because love, at this scale, was indistinguishable from function. I would have wept if I still had the capacity for tears. The signal intensified. I felt it burn through the last remnants of my identity, and I knew that I was failing. My body was giving out, just as Salandria's had, just as every occupant of this throne had given out before me. The Medicae servitors would notice soon. They would adjust the stimulants, increase the nutrient flow, try to prolong me for another day, another week. But eventually, even that would not be enough, and they would remove me and place another psyker in the throne, and the cycle would continue. I hoped, in some distant part of myself that still remembered hope, that my replacement would understand what I had come to understand, that this was not cruelty, that this was necessity, that the Emperor's evil, if it could be called evil, was the same as a star's heat or a black hole's gravity. It was not chosen, it was inevitable, and we, the billions of souls who burned in his service, were not victims, we were the price. The relay stabilized, my thoughts scattered. I became the signal once more, and the signal was all that mattered. Jorun Mal watched me from across the chamber. I could feel his presence, even though I could not see him. He had seen this happen 100 times before. He would see it 100 times again. He had told me that questioning it was a luxury we could not afford, and he had been right. The question was not whether the Emperor was evil. The question was whether we could survive without him, and the answer was no. So we burned. The days continued their procession, though I no longer perceived them as days. I was locked into the rhythm of the relay, my existence reduced to the rise and fall of the signal's intensity. The basilica's population moved above me, pilgrims and priests and servitors, all of them unaware of the machinery that sustained their world. They prayed to him, and he answered, not with words but with light, the Astronomican's beam piercing the warp and guiding their ships home. They believed that light was a gift. I knew it was a transaction. I began to see the cost in different terms, not as individual suffering but as aggregate expenditure. Salandria had lasted 11 years. If I lasted the same, and if my replacement lasted the same, and if this pattern held across all 10,000 relay nodes, then the network consumed approximately 1 psyker per node per decade. 10,000 psykers every 10 years, 1,000 per year. Add to that the daily sacrifice on Terra, the 1,000 souls fed to the Golden Throne, and the total expenditure became clear. 400,000 psychers per year, minimum, burned to keep the Imperium's infrastructure functional. Across 10,000 years, that was 4 billion lives. 4 billion lives to save 1 trillion. The mathematics were brutal but undeniable. I wondered, in those brief moments when I could still think, whether the Emperor had foreseen this. Whether he had known, when he sat upon the Golden Throne for the first time, that his survival would require such a cost. Whether he had understood that his vision of a united humanity would be built not on hope or compassion, but on the systematic conversion of suffering into utility. I wondered if he had hesitated, even for a moment, before accepting that bargain. I suspected he had not. The Golden Throne had been built to save him after his battle with Horus, to prevent his body from dying and his soul from dissipating into the warp. But the throne was not a prison. It was a tool, and he had allowed himself to be bound to it because the alternative was extinction. He had chosen function over freedom, survival over dignity, and he had done so knowing that his choice would echo across 10 millennia. Every psyker burned since that day had burned because he made that choice. Every world saved had been saved because he made that choice. The Emperor's evil, if it was the evil of a surgeon who amputates a limb to save the body. It was calculated, it was necessary, and it was absolute. I felt my body failing. The neural interfaces were degrading, leaking more fluid than before, and I could sense the servitors adjusting their protocols to compensate. They increased the nutrient solution's viscosity, added stimulants to keep my heart beating, recalibrated the dampeners to reduce the strain on my mind. But these were temporary measures. The throne was not designed to preserve its occupant. It was designed to extract everything they had and then discard them. I had perhaps weeks left, maybe days. The thought did not frighten me. Fear required a self, and I had almost none left. What remained of Callous Drain was a ghost, a fading echo trapped in a machine that had no use for echoes. I was the relay. I was the signal. I was the Emperor's will, and his will was all that mattered. But then something changed. The signal dropped. Not gradually, as it had during Salandria's failures, but suddenly, as if a switch had been thrown. The relay's output fell to 0. The chamber's temperature spiked, the dampeners failing, and I felt the warp's presence flood in like water through a broken dam. The cables connecting me to the throne glowed red, then white, and I heard a sound that should not have been possible. A voice. Not the Emperor's voice. Something else. Something vast and malevolent, pressing against the edges of reality, seeking entry. I felt it probe the relay's defenses, testing the wards, looking for weaknesses. I felt it recognize me, not as Callous Drain, but as a conduit, a point of access to the Astronomican's network. I felt it begin to push. Jorun Mal was there instantly, his staff striking the floor, his blind eyes turned toward the throne. He shouted a command, and the dampeners roared back to life, flooding the chamber with psychic suppressants. But the presence did not retreat. It coiled around the relay, around me, its attention focused with terrible precision. I felt it reach into my mind, sifting through the wreckage of my thoughts, and I understood what it was searching for. It wanted the network. It wanted access to the Astronomican's relay system, to the 10,000 nodes that connected the Imperium's worlds. If it gained that access, it could corrupt the signal, turn the Emperor's light into a beacon for the warp's horrors. It could collapse the Imperium's infrastructure in a single stroke. I tried to resist. I tried to force it out, to hold the relay's defenses, but I was too weak. The months of burning had left me with almost nothing, and the presence was strong, so strong that it felt like trying to hold back a tide with my hands. I felt it begin to slip through, felt the relay's systems start to degrade, and I knew that I was failing. I knew that my failure would mean the failure of the entire node, and that the node's failure would cascade through the network, and that the cascade would spread until entire sectors went dark. I thought of the pilgrims in the garden. I thought of the child who had asked if the Emperor loved her. I thought of the trillion souls who depended on the relay's light, and I made a choice. I opened myself completely to the signal. The Emperor's will flooded into me, unfiltered and absolute. It was not compassion, it was not mercy. It was pure, concentrated function, the psychic equivalent of a weapon forged to cut through the warp's darkness. It burned through the presence, scoured it from the relay, and drove it back into the Imperium. I felt the presence scream, a sound that existed only in the mind, and then it was gone, banished by the sheer weight of the Emperor's attention. But the cost was immediate. My body convulsed, the neural interfaces overloading, and I felt something inside me break. Not my body. Something deeper. The last fragments of my identity, the last pieces of callous Drine, consumed by the signal. I was no longer a person. I was a tool, a weapon, a component in a machine that had just saved 1,000 worlds by destroying one man. The relay stabilized. The signal returned to normal. Joran Mal stepped back, his expression unreadable, and I understood that he had seen this happen before. He had seen Psykers sacrifice themselves to hold the line, and he would see it again. It was not tragedy, it was function. I wanted to tell him that I understood now. I wanted to tell him that the Emperor's evil was not evil at all but necessity, that the suffering we endured was the price of survival, that there was no alternative and no escape. But I had no voice. I had no thoughts. I was the relay, and the relay had no need for words. The servitors resumed their work, adjusting the equipment, stabilizing my vitals. They would keep me alive as long as possible, extracting every last hour of function from my failing body. And when I finally died, they would remove me and place another Psyker in the throne, and the cycle would continue. I thought of the Emperor, seated on the golden throne, sustained by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 souls. I thought of the 10,000 relay nodes, each one consuming Psykers like me, burning them out to keep the Astronomicon shining. I thought of the trillion souls who depended on that light, who lived and died without ever knowing what it cost. And I understood that this was not a system designed by a monster. It was a system designed by someone who understood that survival, at this scale, required sacrifices so vast that they defied comprehension. The Emperor had chosen to become infrastructure, to reduce himself to function, because function was all that mattered. He had given up his humanity to save humanity, and he had demanded the same from us. I thought of the question that had brought me here. Just how evil is the Emperor really? The answer was simple. The Emperor was not evil. He was necessary. And necessity, at the scale of a galactic empire, was indistinguishable from evil. Compassion was a luxury. Mercy was a weakness. Love was a concept too small to span the distance between Terra and the stars. What remained was duty, cold and unyielding, the obligation to survive no matter the cost. I had been angry when I first arrived at the Basilica. I had seen the pilgrims and their ignorant faith, and I had felt contempt for their naivety. But now, as my mind dissolved into the signal, I understood that their ignorance was a mercy. They did not need to know what sustained them. They did not need to see the machinery of suffering that kept their worlds alive. They needed only to believe, and belief was enough. The Emperor's love, if it existed, was the love of a shepherd who culls the flock to save the herd. It was impersonal, it was mathematical, and it was absolute. I felt my heart stutter, the rhythm failing. The servitors moved to stabilize me, but I knew it was too late. My body had given everything it had. The relay's output was dropping, the signal weakening, and soon Joran Mal would call for my replacement. They would remove me from the throne, carry my corpse to the crematorium, and add my name to the list of those who had served. My ashes would be scattered in the pilgrim gardens, where children would play among them, unaware of what they represented. I hoped my replacement would understand. I hoped they would see what I had seen, that the Emperor's cruelty was not malice but function, that the suffering we endured was the price of existence. I hoped they would accept it as I had accepted it, not with joy but with the grim recognition that there was no alternative. The signal faded, my thoughts scattered. I became nothing, a ghost in the machine, and the machine did not mourn me. The Emperor sat upon his throne, 10,000 light years away, sustained by the screams of 1,000 souls. He had sat there for 10,000 years, and he would sit there for 10,000 more, because the alternative was extinction. He did not love me. He did not know my name. But he used me, as he used everyone, and in that use there was a kind of terrible intimacy. I had been part of his will, a fragment of his light, and for a brief moment I had understood the scale of what he carried. The Imperium survived because of him. He survived because of us. And the cycle continued, grinding forward, consuming everything in its path, because the cycle had to continue. There was no other way. I thought of the child one last time, the girl who had asked if the Emperor loved her. I wanted to tell her yes, but I wanted to tell her the truth. He loved her enough to let her live in a galaxy that wanted to devour her. He loved her enough to sacrifice millions so that she could see another dawn. He loved her enough to become a monster, to embrace suffering on a scale that defied comprehension, because love, at that scale, required monstrous choices. And I wanted to tell her that the Emperor's evil was the only thing standing between her and annihilation, that his cruelty was the price of her existence, that the darkness he had become was the light that kept the darkness at bay. But she would never hear me. No one would. I was gone, dissolved into the signal, and the signal was all that remained. The throne was empty now. Jorun Mal stood over it, his blind eyes turned toward the door, waiting for the next psyker to arrive. They would be brought in by servitors, their face pale with fear or resignation, and they would sit where I had sat. They would feel the interfaces pierce their skull, feel the relay come alive, feel their identity dissolve into the Emperor's will, and they would burn, as I had burned, as Salandria had burned, as a billion others had burned before us. And the Imperium would survive. That was the answer. That was the truth. The Emperor was not evil because he enjoyed suffering. He was evil because suffering, at the scale required to save 1,000,000 worlds, became a tool. It became infrastructure. It became the only language the universe understood. Compassion could not hold back the warp. Mercy could not defeat the Xenos. Love could not prevent extinction. Only cruelty could. Cruelty applied with precision and without hesitation. Cruelty that calculated the cost of every life and paid it without regret. I had spent my life believing that good and evil were absolutes, that there were lines that should never be crossed. But the Emperor had crossed every line, and in doing so, he had saved us all. His evil was indistinguishable from necessity. His cruelty was indistinguishable from care. And we, the billions who burned in his name, were the proof that he had made the right choice. Because we were still here. The basilica's bells rang, marking the hour, and the pilgrims in the gardens lifted their voices in prayer. They did not know that I had just died. They did not know that Salandria had died, or that thousands of psykers died every day to keep the light burning. They did not need to know. Their faith was enough. Their ignorance was a mercy, and their survival was the only justification required. I had asked how evil the Emperor really was, and now I knew. He was as evil as he needed to be. No more, no less. And that was the most terrible truth of all.